I live in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains in northeast Georgia. It's a beautiful area with hundreds of miles of national forest, some great state parks, and a ton of fantastic camping spots. Unfortunately, my hometown is also relatively poor. While there are some out-of-town residents from Atlanta and other places, many people where I live are really struggling. I do freelance work as a technical writer, so I can do most of my work online. If I didn't have that going for me, I'd probably have to move somewhere else. It's just one of those small towns that can rob you of your ability to accomplish anything in life if you stay there too long, without anything else going for you at least. Excluding a handful of doctors, lawyers, and Georgia Power Company employees, the only employment in the area is at Walmart, fast food places, and a couple of grocery stores. To the east of my town, there's a massive national forest. It's loaded with great camping sites and lots of relatively unused hiking trails. I really enjoy hiking on them with my dog, but it can be a bit of an unnerving experience sometimes. It's about a 10-mile drive from town, and there's no cell phone service or homes for miles. In the past, there have been a lot of vehicle break-ins at the trailheads. The gravel parking lots at some of them glitter with bits of broken glass from what I'm guessing were car windows. Sometimes, there are really shady people hanging around these trailheads or just driving around on the Forest Service roads. These are really rough roads, and you'll see these beat-up $500 cars just barreling along roads meant for a 4x4. Some of the people you see in the cars look like the guy who got crushed by an ATM in Breaking Bad. All that being said, it's still a great place to camp. However, you just have to be careful. A few years ago, two of my friends and I decided to go play paintball in the National Forest. We decided to turn the paintball expedition into a camping trip so we could play the next morning too. After a pretty uneventful day of shooting paintballs at each other, we drove a couple of miles to one of the more popular camping spots. Unfortunately, a church group or something had taken up all the spots in the area. This was really the only camping spot we were familiar with, and it was getting pretty late. We decided to keep on looking, so we drove for about an hour further and further into the woods. By this time, it was getting a bit dark, and we were starting to worry about finding a spot. We all had GPS on our smartphones, but none of us had any service. We turned off onto an unfamiliar road that wasn't in very good shape. In fact, it looked like the Forest Service rangers had used a backhoe to block off the road with a mound of dirt. A broken metal barrier lay in the woods nearby. That said, it looked like 4x4 vehicles had been going over the mound, so it was pretty worn down. Our F-150 had pretty high clearance, so we decided to go over the mound. There was an old gravel road on the other side, and the road was pretty much clear of debris. We drove a few miles down this road and came across an opening next to a small creek. There were some blue tarps hanging over a plywood table nailed to a tree, which seemed kind of odd. That said, it was pretty much dark at this point, and we didn't want to keep driving around all night looking for a camping spot. We left the truck lights running and set up the tent. As we were setting up the tent, I started to notice that there was a lot of trash in the woods surrounding the site. I saw a green bottle laying on the ground. I took a look at the label and saw that it was a bottle of home and garden insecticide. I was really tired at the time, and I just thought that someone had been dumping their home garbage out here. None of us thought it was weird that someone would be dumping garbage in an area that is more than an hour from the nearest home. We set up camp, had some beers, and made chili from scratch. By this time, it was probably around 11 p.m. As we were eating, we noticed a faint glow from the other side of a nearby hill. At first, we thought it was moonlight filtering its way through the trees. However, the angles didn't make sense. It didn't seem to be a bright light, and it wasn't moving. It was kind of like that glow you see over a bright city, but we couldn't see the light source itself. Since there were no other access roads in the area, we decided it wasn't other campers. The hill was about a quarter mile from our campsite, so we decided to go investigate. Under normal circumstances, I know I wouldn't have done so. However, we all had a few rum and cokes in our stomachs, and two of us, Jacob and I, decided to take a look. My other friend, Isaac, decided to stay behind to pop some popcorn over the fire. We started walking towards the light source, and the situation got even stranger. All the trees in the area had their bark knocked off in a circle around their trunks. We thought it could have been the work of a beaver that lived in the creek, but it seemed strange that a beaver would go around all these trees and just knock the bark off in a circle. Jacob and I started talking about the ghost beaver in pretty loud voices, probably due to our drunkenness. As we were almost to the top of the hill, Jacob tripped and yelled, "Oh shit!" A few seconds after he yelled, the light, whatever it was, went out. We looked at each other and decided that maybe we didn't need to see what that light was after all. We walked back in silence and kept looking back every few seconds. We decided to turn off our flashlight and just use the moonlight to get back to the campsite. When we got a couple of 100 feet from the campsite, I could see my other friend, Isaac, walking around the campsite. He was wearing a hooded coat that I hadn't seen him wearing before. For some reason, he was carrying his paintball gun around in his hand. That seemed a little odd, we said to each other. The fire had started to die down, so we couldn't see our campsite very well. At this point, we'd probably been gone for almost an hour. From the distance, it looked like Isaac was looking for something. He kept walking around the site and was peering into the tent. When we were almost back to the campsite, we saw Isaac walk up the road we came in on. We figured that he was going to use the bathroom and didn't want to wander through the woods like us. When we got back, we sat next to the fire and waited for Isaac to return. All of a sudden, we saw him lurch out of the tent. He stumbled a few feet and vomited. After we left, he had a few more rum and cokes, he mumbled. We asked him why he kept wandering around the campsite with the paintball gun, and he got a strange look on his face. "They're locked up in the cab of the truck. Did you unlock it?" We went to check the truck, entered the door code, and saw all our paintball equipment just as we had left it. The keys to the truck were still hidden in a magnetic fob underneath. I got a sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach. "Isaac, what were you doing after we left?" I asked. I was watching a movie on my phone. Then I fell asleep, I guess." "But you were walking around with your paintball gun, right? Did you just change jackets?" Isaac said he had been in the tent since we left, and that he had been wearing the same unhooded fleece all night. Someone had been walking around our campsite, and it wasn't Isaac. At this point, all of us were way too drunk to drive, but we decided to go ahead and pack up and go back to my house for the night. We didn't bother packing up the tent. We just folded it down with the sleeping bags and everything in it. We jumped in the F-150, and I started to drive out. When we got to the dirt hump, we saw something gray blocking our path. The metal barrier that had been lying in the woods earlier was now back on its stand, right on top of the hump. By this point, all of us had sobered up to the situation. No one wanted to get out of the car to try to move the barrier. I had a metal guard on the front of the F-150, so I drove forward slowly, tapping the metal barrier with the front of my truck. It fell right off. It must have just been balanced on top, and we drove over it slowly. We were terrified that it would pop one of the truck's tires as we drove over it, but it didn't. As we drove down the road, we saw a vehicle following us with its lights off. It was probably 1,000 feet behind us, but we kept catching glimpses of it as the moon reflected light off it. I started to drive as fast as I could on the Forest Service road, and the other vehicle kept pace. It didn't get any closer, though. It stayed just 1 or 2 turns behind us. We could only see it when the road straightened out. After about 45 minutes of speeding along gravel roads, we made it back to the main paved road. I started to drive everyone back to my house, but I decided to take a different route just to be safe. Camping can be fun, but very rural camping can be dangerous. I've driven past that metal barrier since that time, but it's always been in place. I would never go down that road again, though. At the time, I was living in Traverse City, Michigan. For those wondering, it's a beautiful landscape with huge glacier-carved hills and Lake Michigan at your back. I rented a little townhouse with a longtime friend a little ways outside the city. I had just gotten a hold of my old bicycle, which I'd had shipped up from my old hometown, and I was raring to start riding around. And that's how this all got started. It was my day off, and I decided to save gas and ride my bike into town. I geared up, checked my tires, and roared off. I had been big on riding my bike once upon a time, and it came back like, well, riding a bike. What I didn't notice, however, was how quickly I was moving. If I'd been paying attention, I would have realized the constant downward slope I was on, and how biking back up it would likely pose a difficulty for my winter-lapsed muscles. But none of that mattered at the time. I made it into town, did some shopping, met up with my roommate for dinner, and generally had a good time until I noticed the sun was setting. So I bid my adieus, hopped on my bike, and pedaled off into the sunset. At first, I did all right, but that aforementioned incline wore me down. By the time I reached the last leg of my journey, it was pitch black, and I was walking my bike. At that point, the road faced me with a choice. On my left was the regular road, which was better lit but also a longer trek to get to the townhouse row I occupied. On my right was my more regular route to and from town. I drove it every day, and had used it to come into town that very day, in fact. It was heavily wooded and unlit, but featured a shorter route, albeit with a steeper hill. I figured since I was already walking, I might as well just take the shorter, familiar path. So I turned on my bike's headlamp and headed into the even greater darkness of the road through the woods. All went well for a bit. I trudged along and cursed myself for being so stupid and overconfident with my bike. Then I heard it. Footsteps off to my right side in the woodland. I stood still, and they stopped abruptly. There, in the blackness, I debated what it might be, but as a veteran of the woods, I hoped it was just local wildlife and continued on. The footsteps started up again. They stopped when I stopped, just a hint later. I started and stopped once more, to be sure I wasn't hearing things. This last time, the steps continued for a solid 10 seconds after I had stopped, making me sure something, or someone, was out there. I still do not know what it was, though I logically leaned towards human, as the gait sounded bipedal and more precise than a quadruped. With this in mind, I weighed my options. If I dropped the bike and ran towards home, it would be far too easy to catch me. The same was true even if I ran back towards town. I was not in any way prepared for a chase, and I didn't want to initiate one. My mind strayed to the utility knife I always carry in my purse, but I shoved that thought aside. I have enough martial arts training to know the knife was a bad idea, and I was more comfortable taking whoever or whatever was out there barehanded, rather than escalating things with a blade. Instead, I called my roommate, who was still in town, gave her my location, and told her what was happening. She told me she'd be there in 10 minutes. I hung up and started walking again. The footsteps started up too, this time faster and out of sync with mine. And that's when I got mad. I have a weird thing where fear makes me angry and hostile, and being stalked through the woods had officially punched my buttons from terrified to murderous. So I turned to the woods and roared, with a voice I didn't know I had. How about you come on out and face me, you piece of shit? I'll rip your stomach open and wear your intestines for a necklace. For the life of me, I don't know where I got the guts or the words for that. It might well have been a bad move. But the woods were rather abruptly quiet, and nothing came at me. I stayed still, staring hard, ready to beat the shit out of anything that moved. Nothing did. Then my roommate came on the scene, her headlights almost blinding me as she turned the curve to where I was. I tossed my bike in her car, and we hauled ass homeward. I collapsed once I got home, vomited from pure nerves, and finally fell asleep around 3 a.m. And that's my story. I'm not sure of much, I will grant you. Was it a person? An animal? I feel compelled to lean towards the former, if for no better reason than because it sounded like a person walking, and what animal would be so precise in its stalking and winding me up? But who knows? Maybe I just scared the shit out of some poor porcupine. Regardless, I'd rather not encounter it again. At the time, I was a 20-year-old female, and I had just moved alone to a small town in upstate New York. I had grown up in another, slightly larger town about 60 miles away, and just wanted a fresh start. I love camping, and often go camping in the Adirondacks, but at that time, I hadn't yet made friends to go camping with, so I wasn't going to venture into the real woods alone. Down the road from where I lived, I found an area where power lines cut through a wooded section. The power lines were perpendicular to the road. It was near a house, but far enough to the right of the house that I thought people wouldn't mind if I walked up the trail that the power lines created. So, I wandered up there, noticing how it was actually pretty deep woods. I managed to get far enough from the house that they couldn't possibly think I was trying to break in or anything. Then, bing! An idea struck me. I could go camping up here. It was secluded enough to give the real woods experience, but close enough to the road that I wouldn't be in real danger from wildlife or anything. Sweet. So I did. I set up camp in this little clearing that I accessed by climbing the hill, following the power lines, and then turning left onto what seemed to be a deer trail. Deer are everywhere in New York. Eventually, I came upon this really nice, flat, grassy clearing. I built my fire off to the side, after making sure to clear away the dead wood, etc. I was feeling really smart and independent. It was creepy to sleep in the woods alone, as I had always had at least one camping companion, but whatever. The next day, I decided to wander further down the path to see where it led. I walked for about a half hour and could see some fields on the right, but they were in the distance, and there was a fence between the fields and the path. So again, I figured people couldn't be mad at me for being there. Then I came across another path heading to the right. I followed it. A couple of feet in, it curved slightly, and there was an old van on the left of the path. Well, that's strange, but it was about 1 p.m., near noon anyway, broad daylight. Birds were chirping, so I felt no danger. I walked up to the van, which had obviously been there a very long time. It was a 70s-style van. It reminded me of the Scooby-Doo van, and was way overgrown with weeds. There were streaks of brownish red running down the side from the bottom of the doors. I looked in and saw what appeared to be old bedding in the back, but it was all shredded. The curtains in the windows were shredded, and the clothing strewn about looked like it was from the 70s or early 80s. I still felt no danger signs. Snickering at the terrible fashions back in the day, I continued along the path for a short time, until I finished rounding the slight bend. I stopped dead in my tracks. Finally, my reptile sense, or whatever you want to call it, woke the hell up and started screaming at me, full volume. Up ahead, there was a creepy-ass doll hanging from the trees by its neck. It was hung with a rope, not just stuck in the trees. Just to the left of that, there was an old garage, overgrown with weeds. To the right of it, though, there was this huge cage-like structure, easily big enough to hold a full-sized man. It seemed to be made up of pipes and other long metal objects, just kind of welded together. Some were up and down, some were across, and the squares they made weren't big enough to fit my head through. It had 4 sides and a ceiling. It also had other creepy-ass dolls hanging from it. There were also reddish-brown stains running down the sides, just like the van. Further behind it, there was a run-down house. Creeped out as all hell, I just turned tail and ran. I am not a runner. I am a chunky girl. I had smoked for 6 years at that point, and I do not run. But I ran that day. I don't even remember the run. I just remember coming upon my campsite, grabbing my tent in one swoop as I ran past. Luckily, I had put my things inside the tent, and ripping it out of the ground as I continued running. I left my cooler, my food, everything behind. I never went back for it either. I dropped the tent stakes somewhere along the way and had to repair rips in my tent. I tore down the hill. I'm still surprised I didn't break my neck, jumped in my car, and sped home. I locked all my doors and then paced my house going, "What the fuck?" for hours. It's been 11 years since that incident, and even typing it now makes my hands shake. I now live almost 1,400 miles away, but I still just made sure my doors were locked. The crazy thing is, it wasn't even in deep woods. Maybe in the 70s it was, though, who knows. As it stands now, though, there are people living within a short walk of that place. I didn't call the cops. I can't really articulate why. My best analysis, looking back, is that I didn't want that creep to come find me. I should have, yes. You're right. I'm just hoping it was an old crime scene and not some sick fuck who still keeps people in cages in the woods. My friends and I decided to go camping one spring break. We had planned a week in advance, and as the day got closer, the weather got worse. It was cold and gray, which is unheard of for Arkansas. The night finally came, along with yet another cold front. It was in the 30s, but we had dressed warmly and stocked up on whiskey and beer. The plan was to hit a spot my buddy knew, which was barely accessible with his 4x4. We wanted to really camp, none of those designated sites for families and seniors in RVs. So we aimed away from civilization, comprising just a single stoplight and a couple hundred people, and drove into the woods. After 30 minutes of bone-rattling dips across dry creek beds and detours around trees, it started to rain. By the time we found camp, it had turned into hail. The spot was marked by an ancient dirt road a few hundred feet long and the rotting carcass of a Volkswagen Bug. That night was spent passing a bottle around, hoping we'd figure out the tents before we were too drunk. Eventually, we did, and managed to start a fire with diesel. By this point, the hail had stopped. The empty whiskey bottle lay broken in the fire, and we had a decent pile of empties growing. We drank, we played cards, and we passed out in our tents. The next morning, I gradually regained consciousness to the sound of something large being dragged past my tent. It was what looked to have once been a station wagon, stripped and rust-covered, dragging the VW with a chain. The VW had been there for so long that the floor had rotted out and roots had tied it to the forest floor. They lay scattered in the wake of the wagon. A woman was driving, a man sat beside her, and 3 shirtless kids sat in the back where there used to be seats. The man stared out the window, away from us, the entire time. The children had dirt smeared on their faces, which illuminated their glassy 1,000-yard stares. It's the look of crushing poverty, and you've probably only seen it in pictures. It exists in war-torn countries, the projects in inner cities, and the deep south. So deep that the old gas station back in town, a place you'd probably jokingly hum the Deliverance theme, was the city to these people. She spoke in a deep nicotine and whiskey-soaked drawl. "Y'all come from the city to do some camping? Well, reckon that's fine, long as you ain't doing no drugs. Y'all ain't doing drugs, are ya?" We weren't. "Just drinking, then." "Hell, I like a drink now and again my darn self, that's fine. That's just fine. Want to know how I knew y'all was here? Seen them black helicopters flying around? Them some boys that work for me, see? This is my land, and they told me. Can't be too careful. Figured I'd best check it on out." She started laughing. Mucus bubbled up to wet her dry cackle. The man stared out at nothing, and one of the children put both hands on the window and gazed through us. His mouth hung open, and spit cut a line through the filth on the glass. He was probably 10 years old. "Y'all know Bethany?" We didn't. "Huh, everyone knows old Beth. Y'all go to church?" I lied. "Good, ain't got time for those that don't fear God. Why don't you come on to church tomorrow? You can meet Bethany. It's just over that hill up there. Can't miss it. Boy, she'd sure like to meet y'all. They all would. We assured her we would. She drove away into the trees, slowly dragging the Volkswagen. As soon as she left, we all looked at each other and started laughing. It was just nerves. There wasn't anything funny about it. We all have the remnants of a primitive warning system for danger. It's been eroded by living safe and civilized. But every once in a while, it goes off, and you obey it without question. Something is wrong. It started before she spoke, when I looked into her eyes. Something is wrong. The kids, the man, her laugh. Eventually we did hike up the hill. You could see for a mile. There was nothing. No buildings, no clearings, just forest. We cut our trip short, packed up, and left before noon.